Hey, folks, it's your buddy Mike Messier. Some sad news if you haven't heard. Kevin Sullivan, the gentleman in the screenshot behind me, has passed away. If you're a pro wrestling fan, you should definitely know who Kevin Sullivan is. Although, for the younger fans, you might learn a thing or two today while we discuss this. And for the older fans, you probably know exactly who Kevin Sullivan is. Kevin Sullivan was a legend in professional wrestling and Georgia Championship Wrestling. I would say Florida Championship Wrestling in the 80s. He was the number one heel by far, feuding with Dusty Rhodes, Blackjack Mulligan, Barry Windham, Kendall Windham, a young Lex Luger. Uh, Comes over to Jim Crockett Promotions, has a really giant feud, teaming, managing basically Mike Rotundo and Rick Steiner as the Varsity Club. They would feud with the Road Warriors, the Legion of Doom. They would have a great match against the Fantastics, Kevin Sullivan and Steve Dr. Death Williams for the U.S. Tag Team title, Clash of Champions 4, December, I believe, 13th, December 6th, I think, 1988, against Tommy Rogers and Bobby Fulton. You can find that match pretty easily. Kevin Sullivan later, a half a generation later or a decade later, would be involved in the Dungeon of Doom. Had an epic match against Chris Benoit with a lot of ramifications at the Great American Bash in Baltimore of '96, a Falls Count Anywhere match. He would reunite the Varsity Club in the 2000s, which is kind of a short-lived gimmick, but he was also a behind-the-scenes guy, uh, being a booker many times for WCW, for Florida, I would assume. He did wrestle in the WWF in his younger days. He was a smaller guy by stature, by height at least. I think Kevin was listed at 5'8", something like that. But at different times in his career, especially when he was younger, he was super ripped, super muscular, had a real, state of the art of the game physique type of thing. And then later, he would maintain his strength, I would say. He was always able to hold his own in wrestling matches, body slamming guys, doing all the moves. He had that great double stomp as a finisher, where you just stomp on your midsection. The Tree of Woe, so many things. The Boston accent mixed with the pseudo Satanism in Florida was just really fascinating. How did I become? And by the way, we are live here. This is 3:58 Eastern Standard Time. Whatever day is today, it's Friday, August 9th, 2024. I believe Kevin passed away earlier today or last night. But if you have any Kevin Sullivan memories, I do have some photographs that I'm going to share. Photographs that you haven't seen anywhere else, unless you're one of the two or three people that have seen them. But these are from the private Mike Messier collection. I'll see if I can go in order of operations here. See if we can get a nice, of course, see if I can get that. But let me figure this out. Fine, folks. I might have to take away the. Everything goes wrong, doesn't it? Well, there you can see it. It's a little. You can see Kevin Sullivan in the Taskmaster garb. That's Mike Rotundo at ringside that Kevin Sullivan is escorting. Let me take off the background just for a few minutes so I can share these photographs because I don't want them to not be apparent. That's the whole reason. See, that's the boring background world that you see. I guess I don't have to do the. Now, of course, we have the light reflection. But you see Kevin Sullivan, and that's in the garb. Mike Rotundo at ringside. Mike Rotundo is wrestling Nikita Koloff in a rematch for the NWA World Television title. That's the Baltimore Arena. I want to say April 13th, 1988. And then we can bounce forward a little bit. Oh, God. That's Kevin Sullivan. Jesus. All these things, folks, you don't see all the goings-ons. Kevin Sullivan, that's the Tower of Doom, folks. That's the real deal. That's Baltimore. That's July 10th, 1988. Kevin Sullivan escaping or trying to escape the Tower of Doom one of the craziest gimmick matches of all time. I don't think they've repeated that, but I mean, that was 10 years before the Hell in the Cell. And that's flash forward a year. That's Mike Rotundo and Kevin Sullivan after their loss to the Steiners at the Great American Bash 89 pay-per-view in a Texas Tornado match. Kevin Sullivan and Mike Rotundo were basically teasing a feud. They were shoving each other to the encouragement of the fans. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, the pay-per-view did not pick up that interaction. The pay-per-view was at instant replays. So if you've ever seen the Great American Bash pay-per-view 1989, which is one of the best pay-per-views of all time, after the Steiners match, they basically have this shoving contest between Sullivan and Rotundo, but the cameras didn't pick it up. So I don't know if they just canceled the feud or whatever, because the cameras didn't pick up the whole catalyst for the feud. Let's see. Personal memoirs and memories of Kevin Sullivan wrestling. I guess you could say the first time I saw him live was the Crockett Cup 87. He was kind of put in there as a substitute member, taking Ole Anderson's place, teaming up with Arn Anderson, and they lost. They were the first team, I think, of the seeded teams. I believe they had like a number 9 seed or a number 7 seed, because it was supposed to be Ole and Arn, but Ole had turned babyface, so Arn was left without a partner. And the other horsemen, Lex Luger and Tully Blanchard, were already in the tournament together. So Arn had to get like the Kevin Sullivan came in as a sub, and they basically had them lose to, I believe, Bob and Brad Armstrong. So it was kind of unceremonial at the time, but Kevin Sullivan always willing to do business, always willing to put guys over. But my real first memories beyond a live match of Kevin Sullivan is just the wrestling magazines. When I was a kid reading these things, my uncle had this stack of wrestling magazines that I would purvey. And there was this Kevin Sullivan and Mark Lewin, the Purple Haze, were in Florida. And there was this article in one of the wrestling magazines. I would think it was maybe July of '83, Inside Wrestling, if I had to guess, something of that ilk. But Kevin Sullivan and Mark Lewin in the forest, like in a forest somewhere with a raccoon that like Kevin Sullivan is holding by the back of the neck. And they were gonna sacrifice. They were gonna have not a human sacrifice, but a raccoon sacrifice. And the writer of the article was just really selling this thing. And they actually used I'm assuming they used some type of post-production special effects to show like lightning in the sky or spiritual realms, like light, like beams of light between Kevin Sullivan and the Purple Haze and the night sky. Basically, Kevin Sullivan was selling a Satanism angle. What did he call Satan? He didn't call Satan Satan. He called like a Buddha Singh or something like that. Like he had like this pseudonym for Satan, but anybody who's watching this would assume it was a Satan gimmick. And this is where he brought in people like Luna Vachon. I think that was her first big break in pro wrestling. Nancy, who would become Kevin Sullivan's wife. I mean, she was just gorgeous. I mean, she was like something out of a Motley Crue music video. Woman was always wearing these very scandalous and skimpy bikinis. She was still called Nancy. She was called like the Fallen Angel, I think, at the time. God, things are just bothering me. But she was so beautiful, brunette, and just as a teenage boy looking at this, it was just so shocking. What else did you have? Mark Lewin, Bob Roop came in. I think they called him Makan Singh or something. So just seeing this troubadour of Kevin Sullivan, it was really ahead of its time. I mean, if you put Kevin Sullivan, I don't even know what he called his group. I'm trying to think if they had like an official name or if it was just Kevin Sullivan and his underlings. And that's the thing. Like at the time, they weren't trying to sell T-shirts. They were trying to sell wrestling tickets, and that's the difference. They weren't trying to tell you how cool they were. They were bad guys for the sake of being bad guys. And, if you think about it, I mean, Kevin Sullivan went there. He went to the Ultimate, in Florida in the South in 1980s. He's basically doing a Satanism gimmick against Dusty Rhodes and Blackjack Mulligan and all these cowboys. Pretty intense stuff. and just really interesting. And then, like I said, as Crockett Promotions in '87 bought out Florida, they basically got Lex Luger, they got Barry Windham, and they got Kevin Sullivan. And so Kevin Sullivan comes in, and you already had like a top tier heel contingency of the Four Horsemen. So Kevin Sullivan kind of does what he does, which is he adapts and he takes Rick Steiner, who's kind of a guy from the Universal Wrestling Federation who was kind of floating around, mostly a tag team guy. And he puts him with Mike Rotundo, who once again was kind of a floater, like Mike Rotundo had been a career babyface up until that point. And somehow Kevin Sullivan corrupts Mike Rotundo. Rotundo had the Florida title at the time. Rotundo ended up handing that title to Rick Steiner, and they actually allowed Steiner to defend the Florida title a little bit. So they were kind of like this undercard, heel contingency who, like the Four Horsemen had Ric Flair in the world title, the Varsity Club had Mike Rotundo in the world television title. And Kevin Sullivan, as the games master, the taskmaster, was behind all this. And eventually, Rick Steiner, because he was talking to his hand Alex, he got to be over as a good guy, and they went with it. They went with Rick Steiner versus Mike Rotundo at Starrcade '88. Meanwhile, Kevin Sullivan and it was actually Kevin Sullivan and Steve Williams against the Fantastics at Starrcade '88. I misspoke earlier. When I said the Fantastics at the Clash, that was actually the Fantastics winning the title from Eddie Gilbert and Ron Simmons in a tournament final at Starrcade '88. It was Dr. Death and Sullivan against the Fantastics. So I corrected myself, folks. You can't say I screwed up. I mean, I did for 20 minutes. Anyway, getting back to things, 1989, the year of Steamboat and Flair and Funk and Flair. Kevin Sullivan was still in the mix for a while. He was doing things, teaming with Rotundo. Steve Dr. Death Williams came and went from the Varsity Club. Dan Spivey, most people forget, was in the Varsity Club for a hot minute, as the kids say. They were doing this kind of feud between Kevin Sullivan and Eddie Gilbert, which eventually got overshadowed when the Great Muta got involved and started going after Eddie Gilbert. I want to say by late '89, Sullivan had kind of been phased out, but then in '90, he kind of comes back strong. He had a new contingency. It wasn't the Varsity Club. It was kind of the predecessor to the mid-'90s Dungeon of Doom. In 1990, you had Abdul the Butcher, a young Cactus Jack, and Kevin Sullivan as a contingency. They were feuding with Norman the Lunatic and so forth. And I think there was a six-man tag, I want to say at Wrestle War 1990 of Sullivan, Cactus Jack, and Abdullah against the Road Warriors and Norman the Lunatic. Does that sound right? Something like that. But basically, Kevin Sullivan was always kind of, in the mix of things. I mean, he really was. I believe there's some type of clip from a Saturday night TBS taping, I want to say from like maybe June of '89, where on a CBS Saturday night, they rebooted the famous Buzz Sawyer Tommy Rich feud, and Kevin Sullivan was somehow involved in that. So they went against the last battle of Atlanta stipulations, and basically they took Tommy Rich, who was an undercard or a mid-card babyface, not doing too well with the win-losses, but they had him wrestle Buzz Sawyer, who I think was managed by Kevin Sullivan, and they had this crazy match. And it's from 1989 TBS. Moving ahead, when Hulk Hogan came into the WCW in 1995, Kevin Sullivan, I believe, was like a booker / wrestler. He put together the Dungeon of Doom. Most people don't have good memories of this. It was really a hodgepodge. It was, guys, and Sullivan explained this in a shoot interview, guys that Hogan was comfortable with, guys like Kamala, guys like Brutus Beefcake as the Zodiac or whatever name he used, guys like John Tenta, the Earthquake or whatever they called him, the Tremor. But basically, they put these kind of carnival type of wrestlers, these WWF goofs, against Hogan for a year and a half. I think it culminated with that three-decker cage match of sorts at an uncensored, like maybe uncensored 96. But then the New World Order came in, and the New World Order really wiped out everything. And Kevin Sullivan was suddenly kind of a babyface. Like Kevin Sullivan, along with the rest of WCW, was kind of aligned together in some ways against the NWO. And then in real life, Kevin Sullivan and Nancy's marriage was kind of falling apart. Chris Benoit took an interest in Nancy. Kevin Sullivan, once again, putting the business first, booked himself against Benoit and was blurring those lines. And that feud, the Benoit feud, basically took over from the Pillman Kevin Sullivan feud with the I respect you Booker Man thing. Basically, Kevin Sullivan was right in the heart of everything. And if you look at this, Kevin Sullivan was never afraid to be the bad guy, even when he's fighting other bad guys. Sullivan's fighting Benoit and Pillman and these other horsemen that were a heel contingency, and Sullivan was willing to be the heel. So, I mean, I just think about it. And in recent years, it's on WWE. There's a rumor or a legend or a story that when WCW was bought out by the WWE in early 2001, eventually, the idea came up from somebody for Kevin Sullivan to work for the WWE in some type of behind the scenes producer or booker role, something like that. And the legend goes is that Stephanie McMahon, asked Kevin Sullivan for a resume. And it just shows I don't know if that story is true or not, but it kind of feels like it's true because it just shows the ignorance of a Stephanie McMahon. No offense. I know all the WWE apologists will be crying in their diapers about it, but the reality is, folks, the WWE has separated themselves from real pro wrestling for a long time. Yes, pro wrestlers go to the WWE and cash a paycheck and they get their money and they get their action figures and they get their WrestleMania moments. But for real pro wrestling fans, intelligent pro wrestling fans like you, like me, we know things about Kevin Sullivan and the Purple Haze. Or for the younger, intelligent fan on the come up, we're here to educate you. I'm here to educate you. I'm here to inform you. So if you're looking for some good Kevin Sullivan stuff, I think your next destination is don't go to your Peacock, okay? Dig around this very thing, YouTube, and you'll find plenty of Kevin Sullivan in Florida. Kevin Sullivan and the Flock, Luna Vachon, the Lock, Bob Roop, Makan Singh. To me, that's the real deal Kevin Sullivan. The Varsity Club, the feud with Jimmy Jam Garvin, or Jimmy Garvin before he was a Freebird in 1988, that was fun. You can look at the Great American Bash. I mean, Kevin Sullivan kidnapping Precious. Once again, there's the photo of Mike Rotundo and Kevin Sullivan. I showed these earlier. If you missed it, folks, you can go back and rewind. But I showed some wonderful photos that you won't see anywhere else of Kevin Sullivan. That's Kevin Sullivan in the Tower of Doom. Go back later to watch this whole podcast if you missed it. But just so exciting. Great mind. I actually had the opportunity to meet Mr. Kevin Sullivan. I give my friend credit, Joseph Bruin, Hardcore Joe of the New England Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. He hosted Kevin Sullivan in the 2013 edition, I believe, and Kevin was there in it was called they called it the Whaling City, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Kevin Sullivan was there, and I spoke to him for a few minutes, and he was a very nice guy, and that's the word from people that have spoken to or met Kevin Sullivan. He was a nice, humble guy off screen. I mean, the whole Games Master thing, he made you believe. He made you believe that what he was doing was real. He was legitimate. He wasn't playing a character. He wasn't, people complain in recent months of the Wyatt Six went to a Whataburger or something like that, and they took a photograph out of character with a fan. And of course, the fan has to run to social media and post his little photograph. And that kind of divides the audience. Like the more modern fan will say, oh, that's no big deal. Who cares? We all know it's, wrestling. But the old schoolers will kind of say, hey, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't ruin your gimmick right off the bat by taking pictures of the fan out of character. I would kind of split the difference and say, hey, if the kid really wanted to, it wasn't even a kid, it was a full grown adult. But if this guy wanted a picture with the Wyatt Six, why didn't they do something where they all put on like their mask or they cover their face or they did something kind of in character, like it would have taken just as long for them to do something kind of artsy or something interesting, not just a generic photograph of this mark. But, people aren't that intelligent. They don't think that far in advance. I know I do, but most people don't. So when you're talking about a guy like Kevin Sullivan, I mean, imagine the things that if he and a guy like Bray Wyatt had teamed together, if they had been put together in a relationship with like a student mentor. Imagine the Prince of Darkness, Kevin Sullivan, in the corner of Bray Wyatt, during some of that WWE stuff in 2016, 2017. But of course, Stephanie McMahon needed her little resume now, didn't she? So, I mean, obviously, the disrespect, the disregard is unbelievable. And that's why an intelligent wrestling historian like myself is not going to sit there and watch WWE and pray to the altar of these pieces of shit. Because real pro wrestlers like Kevin Sullivan, to me, that's what pro wrestling is, was, and shall always be. I guess I shouldn't go further without saying, Eddie Graham was a big influence. Eddie Graham in Florida, his son Mike Graham, they gave Kevin Sullivan a giant palette for his artistry. I'm getting all choked up. But if you can't talk about Kevin Sullivan without mentioning Eddie Graham and Florida Championship Wrestling and stuff like that. So here I am in Florida, and when I go to these NXT house shows, out of respect more so to the past than to the future, or of course the present, it's because I feel like I'm in the footsteps of the ghosts of Florida Championship Wrestling. And the superstar Billy Graham had a feud with Kevin Sullivan. I think in 1983 or 84, Billy Jack Haynes felt the vengeance of Kevin Sullivan. And I'm missing out on a bunch of stuff, folks, because there is a whole other world of Kevin Sullivan when he was a babyface in Georgia Championship Wrestling with Gordon Soley. I have seen some of those clips on YouTube. I'm not that very much informed about that era of Kevin Sullivan. Like I said, my fandom started more with the Florida days. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can touch on. I mean, he also did stuff, things like Continental Wrestling, even the Savoldi circuit, like the New England, occasionally like in the mid 80s, 86, stuff like that, 85, you'd see Kevin Sullivan would do something with the Savoldis in New England. But I mean, I really just, when I think of Kevin Sullivan, I think of basically Florida Championship Wrestling, and I think of World WCW, his contributions behind the scene, but in front of the camera, the Dusty Rhodes feud, the Varsity Club, stealing Precious from Jimmy Garvin, the Tower of Doom, all these things. When we were youths, we had a little song for the Varsity Club. I'll see if I can sing that for you. Well, we had a little tribute song. It was something like this: Varsity Club, Varsity Club, va 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 Varsity Club, Varsity Club, Varsity Club, va 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 Varsity Club, and we would kind of bark that out to Kevin Sullivan and in honor of him and tribute to him. So that's it. I mean, for crying out loud, folks. But I will say this. You know what? I heard that Kevin had last couple of years were tough for him physically, and we should all remember that type of thing because no one here gets out alive, folks. I mean, I try not to dwell on people dying that much. Just to say, I don't dwell on their death. I dwell on their life. Let's honor. If you live to be 38, if you live to be 16, if you live to be 102, what did you do with your time on this earth, on this platform, on this realm? Whether you're a person of faith or a person of non-faith. In a sense, what did you do while you were here with what you had at your fingertips or what you got in front of you? So I think it's just one of those things. I say thank you, Kevin Sullivan. There is another pro wrestling Kevin Sullivan, by the way. There's another person, behind the scenes person, but this is the Kevin Sullivan for the most part on camera that we all knew. I pay my respects to Kevin Sullivan. I hope you do as well. In case you're wondering, well, gee whiz, Mike, tell us a good match we can watch Kevin Sullivan in. As far as he was more, to me at least, he was more of an angles guy than a matches guy. But I will go back to what I said, and I know I flubbed it earlier, but if you really want to see a good goddamn Kevin Sullivan match, Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers. I think Bobby Fulton's real name is Jimmy Hines. He's on Facebook. Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers against Steve Dr. Death Williams and Kevin Sullivan at Starrcade 88. The Tower of Doom is one thing that the WCW or NWA, because it was Jim Crockett Promotions' last pay-per-view, they weren't really good with recapping feuds on their pay-per-views. So I don't know if somewhere on YouTube someone's put together a compilation of the Kevin Sullivan Jimmy Garvin 1988 feud. But if there was, maybe the pre-show to the '88 Great American Bash pay-per-view, but a thing where like if you could see all the stuff, there was a thing on TBS of Kevin Sullivan like scooping up, this is a guy's wife for Christ's sakes, like scooping up Precious and putting her over his shoulder and taking her to the back. But if you could find that, that's a good one. I mean, there's got to be some Kevin Sullivan, there's an image for you. Kevin Sullivan, there's Purple Haze and Dusty Rhodes are in a steel cage match in Florida. I think it's a loser leave town match. And Kevin Sullivan emerges from the canvas. Like you see his head poking out of the canvas and he's breaking through. And as far as I know, folks, that's the first time that gimmick ever been used. I mean, the WWF or WWE copied it 10 years later with The Undertaker. But as far as like a guy breaking through the bottom of the ring to interfere and having to like camp out underneath the ring for the whole show, that was Kevin Sullivan did that first, folks. That wasn't goddamn Undertaker or Vince or Bruce Pritchard's idea. That was fucking Kevin Sullivan, for crying out loud. And I think that match is what led to the Midnight Rider, because Dusty Rhodes lost the loser leave town match. So the Midnight Rider had to come in and help out Dusty, for God's sakes. So, I mean, there's this image somewhere in one of the wrestling magazines of Kevin Sullivan. His face is painted like purple. I mean, it's a black and white photograph, but you think it's purple. All these memories, folks. I mean, if you're talking mid-'80s wrestling, you're talking '80s wrestling, you're talking Kevin Sullivan. He was always in the mix. He was always at the top of the charts. I mean, if he had, I want to say that him and Roddy Piper did do something together in Florida. I know they had their interactions in Georgia. I think Piper came to Florida once and teamed with Sullivan against Dusty Rhodes and somebody. There's another thing of Kevin Sullivan like brainwashed Mike Davis. Mike Davis, if you remember, Mike Davis was kind of an underneath guy, the rock and roll RPMs, and Kevin Sullivan brainwashed Mike Davis to think that he was Dusty Rhodes. And so if you look once again on YouTube, you can find Mike Davis, Davis, a guy who really did nothing, not to say nothing, but he wasn't very highly remembered. He was an NWA junior heavyweight champion. He wrestled at Starrcade 84. But if you look for Mike Davis as Dusty Rhodes with Kevin Sullivan, it's hilarious. It's great. There was a thing of Kevin Sullivan blinding Dusty Rhodes' sister. So I guess that would be Cody's aunt and Dustin Rhodes' aunt. But they had this gimmick of Dusty Rhodes' sister, I believe, getting blinded by Kevin Sullivan with like some type of salt or something, or some type of ink. Oh my goodness. Just wonderful memories. I mean, they're just cultivating now. They're a buffet of Kevin Sullivan memories in my mind. But folks, this is the real type of tribute. Like I said, I'm just giving you matches. Of course, about 1% of you will actually do as I say and look up these matches. But for the 1%, Kevin Sullivan and Steve Williams versus the Fantastic Starrcade 88, the Kevin Sullivan Jimmy Garvin feud over Precious in 1988, the Dusty stuff from Florida, all these wonderful things. And okay, if you want another match, obviously, but I guess I take it for granted. Yes, put aside your Benoit thoughts. Great American Bash, 1996, God damn it. Baltimore, Sullivan versus Benoit in Baltimore, 96 for Christ's sakes. But find that match as a tribute to Sullivan. And remember that these two guys, Benoit and Sullivan, are fighting over a real life woman in real life at the time. So very exciting. What else? Just unbelievable. All right, folks. I guess that's it. I mean, you've heard what I say. Now act upon it. One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan. I'm not on Facebook. I'm on Instagram as Mikey Messier. X, as they say. One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan is on X. Thanks to my buddy Lou Thez there. What would Lou Thez do? He's a nice retweeter of this information. My buddy Jimmy Fluka and everyone else. I do have another podcast buddy at times, Gonzo, in case Gonzo is listening. Leave some contact information. I haven't been able to reach you because I'm not on Facebook, Gonzo. But for everyone else, have a wonderful weekend. And this weekend, think of Kevin Sullivan as a way that a wrestler should behave in public. Mike Messier.